40 minutes before the last ferry crossing that could carry Reid Drummond to his brother's burial. A woman in a camel coat arrived at the North Sydney terminal and told the booking agent to give her his cabin. Reid had driven 3.5 hours from Antigonish in a 12-year-old pickup with a cracked side mirror. He was wearing a flannel shirt under a canvas work jacket that had been washed so many times the color had gone somewhere between green and gray, and he had been processed at the counter without anyone looking up twice, which was the way he preferred it. The woman's name was Laurel Whitmore. She stated this along with her requirements: 2 berths in a private cabin for herself and her business associate, a morning call she could not miss, the Confederation Bridge closed for maintenance until Saturday, and only 1 private cabin remaining on the manifest, cabin 14A, belonging to a Mr. R. Drummond, which she required. Paul Chiasson, behind the counter, told her cabin 14A was confirmed and paid. The passenger was standing right there. Laurel looked at Reid the way a person looks at something in the road. "Name a number," she said. Reid told her no. She said $2,000. He told her he was going to bury his brother, that Henry had died on Tuesday, cardiac arrest, his kitchen in Charlottetown, no warning, and the service was Friday morning at 9 at St. Dunstan's Basilica, where their parents had been married in 1967, that this was the last crossing before the Northumberland Strait closed for the storm already building on the marine forecast, and that he had checked the Environment Canada models himself, and there was no Saturday option. Something moved in Laurel's face. 1 second. $5,000, she said. "I'll rebook you Saturday morning first class." Reid told her there was no Saturday. He told her the storm was modeled to hold through the weekend, and he had read the marine advisory twice. Laurel turned back to the counter and asked for the terminal supervisor. The supervisor's name was Barry Nolt. He arrived from the operations area already nodding at whatever name Laurel had used on her call, and he went behind the counter and began typing before he had spoken to Reid at all. Paul said something Reid couldn't fully hear. Barry answered without pausing. Paul tried again. This time Reid caught the end of it, that the passenger had confirmed boarding rights and had already been issued his key card. "Vessel inspection flag on the booking," Barry said, "that supersedes confirmed cabin status pending clearance." It was a real code in the real operational manual. It existed to flag mechanical deficiencies on the vessel itself. Reid knew this because he had approved the language himself, years ago, in a rented office above a chandlery in Dartmouth, while the company was still 2 leased vessels and a debt he could not say aloud without his voice shaking. It had never been written to do this. Barry came around the counter and told Reid there was a hold on his crossing, that it would take some time to clear, and that he was welcome to wait in the main terminal. Reid asked whether the hold had been opened before or after the woman in the camel coat had spoken to him. Barry said he wouldn't discuss other passengers. Reid walked to the customer service desk at the center of the terminal, where a supervisor named Gail Thibodeau stood with a headset around her neck and a stack of boarding manifests on the counter in front of her. He set his bag down and put both hands flat on the surface. "I need you to pull up the vessel ownership registry," he said. "Not my booking. The legal owner of the operating company for this terminal. Coastal Atlantic Ferry Services Limited. It's a Transport Canada filing. 2 clicks." Gail told him she couldn't access ownership records at a customer counter, and that if his booking had an issue, he should speak to the terminal supervisor. Reid told her the terminal supervisor had created the issue. He stayed where he was. Barry Nolt came down from the counter area and told Gail the reservation was under review, the matter was being handled, and that continued disruption at multiple service points would be logged as a disturbance. He said he had been in marine terminal operations for 16 years, and he knew exactly what this was. Laurel's voice came from behind them, unhurried. She said that the gentleman had already refused $5,000, and that in her experience, a person who refuses $5,000 is not looking for money. He is looking for an audience. A few passengers nearby glanced over, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Reid kept both hands on the counter and asked Gail one more time to retrieve the controlling ownership entry for Coastal Atlantic Ferry Services Limited and the natural person listed as beneficial owner. Gail typed something. The clock on the wall read 14 minutes past 9. The gangway closed at 9:45. He thought about calling Alan Strickland, his chief of operations. One call, and in 30 seconds Alan would begin making calls that would end with Barry Nault standing in a corridor, accounting for the last half hour of his career. Reid took out his phone. He looked at it. Then he set it face down on the counter. Because if he had to reach outside this building to be treated correctly inside it, he already had his answer about the company, and it was a bad answer. What he didn't know was that the registry had already been opened. Paul Chiasson had pulled it at 9 past 9 from his terminal at the booking counter, because a passenger had named the exact filing category in the exact language of the internal compliance directory. In 4 years behind that counter, Paul had never once heard a passenger use those words. The screen showed a plain document header, the kind that regulatory filings use. Coastal Atlantic Ferry Services Limited, registered owner of vessels MV Abogwite, MV Northumberland Spirit, MV Cape Traverse. Parent company Drummond Maritime Group Limited, controlling shareholder and beneficial owner Reid G. Drummond. Residential address Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Paul read it twice. Then he looked at the cancelled booking in the adjacent window, cabin 14A, Drummond Reid G., and felt the floor tilt. He did not shout it across the terminal. He did what the training document said to do, which was flag a compliance discrepancy to 2 addresses, the corporate inbox and the terminal director's direct line. At 9:11, Victor Arsenault's phone rang upstairs. Victor listened for 12 seconds, said say that again, listened for another 15, then he was moving. He came through the operations door fast, lanyard swinging, tablet in hand, 2 dock supervisors behind him. He walked past Barry Nault without slowing, past Laurel, and stopped in front of Reid Drummond and stood there the way a man does when he needs to confirm something with his own eyes before he trusts it. "Mr. Drummond," Victor said. Every person within 20 feet heard the register of it. Reid told him he had a confirmed cabin reservation on the 9:45 crossing and needed to board. Victor turned and looked at Barry Nault. Something happened to his face that was worse than anger because it was quieter. "Reinstate it," Victor said, "right now." Barry typed. The booking came back to confirmed status in under 5 seconds, which was approximately how long the entire process had ever needed to take. The terminal went quiet in a ring, spreading outward from the counter, as the people nearest passed what they knew to the people behind them. Laurel heard it from her associate, who had been standing close enough to read over Barry's shoulder. He leaned in and said 4 words. She turned and looked at Reid. The canvas jacket, the single bag on the floor, the man she had offered $5,000 to 15 minutes ago. "You own it," she said. Reid told her he owned the parent company, that Coastal Atlantic was one of 3 lines under it, and that he had been standing at this counter for half an hour because he needed to get to Charlottetown. He said no one was to be escorted out or suspended on the floor that night. He said Laurel and her associate were to board as booked in whatever accommodation they had arranged, and that anyone who attempted to remove them would be treated as having violated a direct instruction. He said the only thing he wanted from Coastal Atlantic Ferry Services in the next 10 minutes was what any passenger with a confirmed reservation wanted, which was to board his vessel. He picked up his bag. Paul Chiasson was standing at the gangway scanner with the key card already reprinted, because he had reprinted it before anyone told him to. He held it out and said he was sorry. Reid told him he was the only person in the building who had done his job, and that he would remember it. Then he walked down the ramp. He was in cabin 14A at 9:31. The MV Abogwite pushed back 7 minutes late into a Northumberland Strait that was already showing white on the wavetops. He was changed into his black suit when the vessel docked at Wood Islands at 12 past midnight. That was where the night broke a second time. The Trans-Canada between the terminal and Charlottetown had been closed at Murray River 2 hours earlier. A tanker truck jackknifed on black ice, both lanes blocked. Transport PEI was estimating 4 to 6 hours for clearance. The alternate route south added 40 minutes and was showing active ice warnings. The service was at 9 in the morning. Alan reached him in the terminal lot and had already worked the problem. There was a helicopter available in Summerside. a licensed operator with a current instrument rating, willing to fly the 30-minute route if the owner asked. Reid asked what the actual conditions were at altitude between Wood Islands and Charlottetown. Allen read them: ceiling variable, wind gusts to 50 knots, active freezing precipitation at 300 feet, no clearance committed. Reid asked whether the pilot would be volunteering or assigned. There was a silence on the line that answered before Allen did. He'd know who's asking, Allen said. Same thing, Reid said, and ended the call. He sat down on a bench in his funeral suit in a terminal building that closed in 40 minutes, and he thought about Henry. He thought about the summer Henry had driven 16 hours from Charlottetown to Dartmouth to help him carry 3 filing cabinets into that rented office, complaining the entire way about the Trans-Canada traffic, cheerfully and without stopping. He thought about the Sunday night calls that lasted sometimes 2 minutes and sometimes 2 hours, and how neither of them had known which kind it would be until they said goodbye. A woman from the overnight maintenance crew had been standing near the doorway for the last several minutes. Her name was Brenda McLeod, and she'd worked the Wood Islands terminal for 9 years. She walked over and said she wasn't trying to intrude, but that she knew the back roads between here and Charlottetown the way she knew her own driveway. The Montague route cut through without touching the Trans-Canada entirely, and that she could have him at St. Dunstan's Basilica by 8:30 if he was willing to ride in a truck that smelled like her dog. Reid asked her why. She said her mother had died in the spring of 2019, and that Brenda had been in Moncton when the call came, and hadn't made it back in time. She said she'd spent 5 years thinking about what she'd do if she ever got the chance to be on the other side of that. Reid looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and said he'd be grateful. They drove through the dark on roads Brenda navigated from memory, past frozen fields and tree lines and the scattered lights of farms set back from the road. And Brenda talked about her mother the whole way, in the easy manner of a person who has made peace with a loss without releasing it. And Reid said very little, which she seemed to understand was not coldness, but simply the way he was holding himself together for the hours still ahead. He reached St. Dunstan's at 8:47. Henry's daughter saw him first from the top of the steps and came down without a word and put her arms around him, and he stood there in the November cold and held on. The burial that followed was brief and cold and right. What happened afterward took 4 months. Reid commissioned an external audit of reservation override procedures across all 3 ferry lines, gave the auditors unrestricted access, and instructed them in writing that no finding was to be softened on account of who had commissioned it. What they returned was worse than a single bad night in North Sydney. 214 instances over 30 months in which a confirmed passenger reservation had been placed under inspection hold, displaced, or quietly downgraded within 20 minutes of a priority account request. 61 of those involved the vessel inspection code. 9 involved passengers traveling under documented compassionate circumstances, bereavements, medical emergencies, family crises. Reid read the report over 2 evenings and wrote 1 line in the margin of the summary page. This began with me. The policy changes went out in February. An inspection hold could no longer be applied to a passenger booking without a written reason entered at the moment of opening and countersigned by a second supervisor at a separate workstation. A confirmed cabin reservation could not be involuntarily displaced for any commercial reason, with no exemptions for corporate accounts, premium tiers, or government travel. Every override was to appear in a monthly report distributed to the board and to frontline supervisors at every terminal. Barry Nault was not dismissed for what he had done to Reid Drummond. He was dismissed for the 7 prior occasions, identified during the audit, on which he had applied the same inspection code to passengers, whose names no one had ever followed up on. The letter of termination stated this plainly, because Reid had insisted the reason be written without softening. Gail Thibodeau completed a mandatory retraining program under new accountability requirements and kept her position. Victor Arsenault remained as terminal director. He had acted within 12 minutes of learning the facts, and Reid told him that 12 minutes was a good number, and that the failure had never been the 12 minutes. Paul Chiasson was promoted, first to a senior booking role, and 8 months later to a newly created position that Reid had pressed the company's chief executive to establish, Terminal Compliance Officer, carrying independent standing to countermand a supervisor's instruction on passenger rights grounds. Paul had opened a registry on a Thursday night because a stranger asked him to. It had cost him nothing. It had changed everything. Brenda McLeod received a letter from Reid's office and a standing travel pass on any Drummond maritime vessel, good for the rest of her life. She called the number on the letterhead and said the pass was too much, and she hadn't done anything worth noting. Reid told her that was exactly right, and that was the whole point. The fund was announced in April. It was called the Henry Drummond Travel Bursary, and it did one thing. When a person needed to reach a dying family member or a burial and could not cover the fare on their own, the bursary paid for it. More importantly, and Reid had pushed harder on this than on anything else, a block of reserved accommodation was held permanently on every vessel in the fleet at no cost to the operating margin, and could not be released for commercial use under any circumstance at any terminal for any reason whatsoever. Money, he had told his chief executive, is the simpler half. The harder half is making sure the berth is still there when the person arrives, so that someone standing at a counter at midnight with no connections and no leverage can still get home. In its first full year, the bursary moved 411 passengers. Reid was not at the announcement. He drove back to Antigonish, to the house with the cracked side mirror still unrepaired on the truck and the mailbox at the end of the driveway still leaning east because the post had never been set deep enough in the clay. He still stopped at the same Tim Hortons on the Trans-Canada he'd been stopping at since the company was 2 boats, and a lease he wasn't sure he could make. Laurel Whitmore published a written account of what she had done in North Sydney 5 months after the crossing. She read it aloud in a Halifax conference room to a group that included Paul Chiasson and Gail Thibodeau, and a call center employee who had fielded 3 complaints filed that year by passengers displaced under the same code. She described what she had done at the counter in order, without softening any of it. She said she had used a name the way a person uses a key, and the door had opened in 11 minutes, and she had never once asked whether it should have. Then she did the part nobody had required. She had gone back through her firm's records and found 6 occasions across 3 years in which someone in her office had made a similar request at a travel or transportation counter. She read those out as well, including the 4 she said she had not known about. She said that not knowing had been the arrangement, that if she didn't know, she bore no responsibility, and that she had decided to stop finding that acceptable. She made restitution to every affected passenger who could be identified, and stepped back from 2 board positions. Reid was in the room and said nothing while she spoke. Afterward, he told her the statement had been enough. She seemed to understand what that meant and what it did not mean, and she accepted both. He had built the company the way he had, name buried in a filing, no interviews, no profile, because he wanted to see how the world treated a man who looked like nothing. It was, he had told himself early on, the only honest way to measure what he was building from the inside. On one November night in North Sydney, the answer had been clear and it had not been good. What had changed it was a booking agent who opened a registry because a stranger asked him to. A terminal director who moved when he learned the facts. A woman with a truck and a dog who drove through the dark because she remembered what it had cost her not to. None of them had been required to do any of it. There was no policy compelling them, no consequence waiting if they hadn't. They had done the ordinary human thing in the ordinary moment, when nothing was watching them but their own sense of what a person does. The measure of any organization is not how it treats the person at the top who has the power to expose it. It is how it treats the one who holds nothing, and whether the people inside it choose decency on their own, in the quiet moment, before anyone has to ask.